My name is Dr Patrick Fitzgerald, Head of Research Development at the Mellon Centre for Migration Studies at the Ulster American Folk Park. I thought I should maybe start by explaining to you that I'm wearing somewhat unusual footwear. And it's not some bid for modern chic in terms of urban meets rural, and these were recommended. But as I was going out the door in rural Tyrone this morning, I thought they are somewhat appropriate and being a kind of a nod to the fact that my introduction to plantation studies does go back to the built heritage and does go back to field trips that we organised back in the 1990s, taking mature students to a variety of sites both in East Tyrone and then in West Fermanagh around the plantation era. And again, as William was saying about the remarkable Bob Hunter, as that wonderful photograph showed us, you know, the immediacy, the wonderful sense that one gets of the past in that connection. One very quick story. In 1996 we were at Tully Hog outside Cookstown, inauguration place of the O'Neills, and I was waxing lyrical about the 9 Years' War when behind me and behind the hedge popped up a fully camouflaged squatty who said in his broad Essex accent, "All right, mate." And you know, it's that kind of frisson between past and present that you cannot buy. So that the resonances go on from plantation. Okay, just to let you know about this session, we're moving away from a focus on the human, the individual, the prosopography of the collective, to look now at, I suppose, the geographical unit, one of the key geographical units that encompass these individual migrant settlers, by looking at estates, the plantation estates, and looking at the representations of them through survey work and through cartography and mapping. The plan is 3 20-odd minute presentations, and then at the end we'll hopefully have time for Q&A and discussion. Dr Annaleigh Margey is and has been for a while Head of Humanities at the Dundalk Institute of Technology. She's built, and before that she completed undergraduate, postgraduate work at the University of Galway. She's built up a great reputation for her expertise with regard to early modern cartography, but she's not just a cartographer or a specialist even in that area, as her piece in the Cambridge History of Ireland Volume 2 demonstrated, where she's talking very broadly about the theme of plantations. Today she will address us to the title of Maps and the Plantation. So over to Annaleigh.
Thank you very much, Paddy, and thank you so much to Mary and the wider organising team for inviting me along to the conference. I'm sorry that I can't be there in person today. I hope you can see the presentation okay. That's great. Well, I'm very honoured to be able to speak today about research that I've really been conducting on the maps of the plantations for the last 25 years at this stage, which sounds like a lifetime, and I suppose it is, but it has meant that I've been really focusing in on trying to understand the wider collections of maps that are available for the whole country during those decades. And my paper, as I say, is based on this research. When I would have begun this research, I suppose 25 years ago now, maps would have been quite underutilised really as a tool in historical research, particularly for the plantation period. There had only been a handful of scholars who had worked on them, particularly led by Professor John Andrews, who would have interrogated maps in their own right rather than them just being something that accompanied sort of texts or mere illustrations. And what's interesting is that he would have looked at maps as tools of administration and also planning within the wider English and later, of course, British settlement in Ireland. In recent years, however, I'm glad to see that historians and geographers have really begun to look at them more widely and to very much view them as part of the apparatus of the state in the early modern period. And that change of scholarly direction really coincided with what we describe in geography as a cultural turn, particularly in the study of cartography, when cartographic historians like J.B. Harley began to ask us to question maps and what we were actually seeing in maps, to see them not just as wayfinding devices, but as objects of control and power in their own right. And through that viewpoint, they began to create a framework for maps that spoke really to the rhetoric and practice of early modern governance in Ireland, particularly in terms of exploration and colonial mapping in general. Since that, historians and historical geographers like Willie Smith in his seminal work, Map-Making Landscapes in Memory, argued that in the Irish context, and I quote, the map became the eye of the state, the imperial eye, which ranged over landscapes and peoples as an instrument of both survey and surveillance, and if necessary as an instrument of colony. So today I want to introduce a little bit more about these maps, particularly those for the Ulster Plantation, to show how they were a fundamental part of that plantation in the province. And it will introduce just a selection of the maps so you can see the range of those for the various phases of plantation, particularly the reconnaissance, subjugation, preparing for plantation, plantation itself, and then the urban mapping and the estates. So to really begin then, I want to look in particular at the maps as very much cartographic representations. And in the first instance, I suppose, one of the ways that I like to look at this is to consider what did we know about cartography in Ireland in the pre-plantation period. So Englishmen, what did they know of Ireland? And the answer really is not a lot. They were reliant on cartographic representations that were based on the likes of Ptolemy's work in particular. And by the 1520s, things didn't look too much different than Ptolemy's work, with the only early manuscript map of Ireland showing what could be described as a very rudimentary geography. So this would of course have been Ulster, to the right of this map, so that you can see they really didn't have that much great geographical knowledge, or indeed anything like a map that you or I would understand today. So geographical knowledge of Ireland was based entirely on written reports that the administrators would have received that described the landscapes through which maybe armies were passing, or indeed surveyors were passing, and they would have introduced them to the Gaelic lordships of Ireland. So it meant that as early as the mid-1540s, when plantation really begins in earnest in Ireland, there were very little pictorial representations of the country as a whole. But by the 1540s, maps were really emerging as part of England's administrative armoury in Ireland. And as such, those maps began to play a role in all aspects of administration, from reconnaissance right through. And that interest has bore significant fruit, as we will see, hopefully, as we go through the paper today. The upsurge, of course, happened very much at a point in time when England's interaction with Ireland began to increase and geographical thinking began to pervade every level of governance in Ireland. It's not unsymbolic really that images of Queen Elizabeth I, for example, began to show her standing on maps around the period of time when exploration, particularly in the early modern world, was increasing. And by the 1560s, for example, here in Ireland, Ulster was of course in the spotlight with Shane O'Neill's rebellion, and by the 1570s, Munster began to be in the spotlight with rebellion there also, and they began to realise that they knew very little about the Irish landscape, particularly the inhospitable landscape of Ulster and Munster. So calls were made by Queen Elizabeth herself as early as 1567 for plats of the province to be sent to her, and early cartographers like Robert Lythe began arriving in the province by the end of the 1570s. That interest was also then increased further by administrators in general. Key statesmen like William Cecil, Lord Burghley, the Queen's Lord Treasurer, and later his son Robert Cecil, who became Secretary of State in his own right under James I, would have often used maps to aid them in their day-to-day administration in Ireland. Lord Burghley's handwriting, for example, which is very obvious, can be seen right across maps of Ireland in the late 16th century. And we know that he too also drew maps of Ireland almost as aid memoirs. This one accompanies some correspondence that he happened to be reading on a given day. It doesn't look like a map that you or I might know today, but you can see he's clearly delineating the likes of Munster here at the bottom and Ulster here at the top, with some of the locations that he was reading about in his correspondence placed around the country. So geographical thinking was beginning to expand. In the Irish context, of course, by the 1560s, maps of Ireland were becoming a little bit more commonplace, with the first maps of Ireland being produced by mapmakers like John Gough. Gough's map, for example, which has been reproduced many times, saw Ireland very much in a familiar stance on its side, with north at the right. Ulster, as you can see, was very little known by the 1560s, with the emphasis really being on the east coast rather than on the west coast, showing really where Englishmen would have had their most interaction with up until that point. Of course, that was to change by the mid-1560s with Shane O'Neill's rebellion, when much of Ulster began to be explored by Englishmen for the first time. So when we think then about mapping in Ulster, we can very much look at the idea that maps of Ulster begin to increase significantly from the 1570s. And to give you an idea of what types of material is out there, we know that it has left behind a significant legacy of maps. We have about 400 surviving maps now for the Ulster Plantation period, and more come to light all the time. They're in major locations across Britain and Ireland, the likes of the National Library, Trinity College, and also the British Library, but they're also in smaller locations like the Guildhall Library, Drapers Hall in London, and some have even ended up in private hands, where I found one in an ensuite bathroom. So they really are spread quite widely across both Ireland and Britain. In the first instance, as I said, we can look at why these maps were made and the phases in which they were made. And it's quite interesting that we can broadly see how maps begin to change over time as England's role in the province of Ulster also begins to change. And as I've noted before in my writing, there are broadly about 6 phases of map making across from the 1570s onwards. So if we look at reconnaissance mapping, for example, amongst the most famous of the maps would be this one, which is a Francis Jobson map of Ulster from the 1590s. By 1590, an entry in the Treasurer's account was noting that he was appointed to, and I quote, take the plot of the countries of Tyrone, both the Clandeboys, the Route, and other parts of the province of Ulster. Jobson's resulting provincial maps are crucial pieces of evidence in our understanding really of how the relationship with the province was beginning to change at the end of the 16th century. As the 9 Years' War was erupting, for example, Jobson was providing representations of not just the Gaelic lordships, which are marked across the map. You can see here Maguire and Fermanagh very clearly, but also what was going to be the new emerging geography of English counties. And all along the sides of the map here, you can see an inscription that delineates the landscape of each county in the province of Ulster. You can also see, for example, that they were beginning to think around the types of buildings that would be useful in a plantation, with the inclusion in particular of military buildings in red across the province, like these ones here along what would be the River Foyle. And then in turn, we can also see how the idea and the concept of how England was beginning to claim this landscape as part of their English lands was pervasive, with the beginning of the inclusion of royal seals on maps of the province. So Jobson really would have given English officialdom their first insight into that wider geographical expanse of the province, and really helped administrators to sort of situate the locations that they were dealing with on a day-to-day basis. By, of course, the 1590s and the early 1600s, that relationship was changing, particularly when war was erupting in the province. And we know at the height of the 9 Years' War in particular, that English authorities would have sent map makers like Richard Bartlett into the province in the retinue of Lord Mountjoy's army to understand more about the military landscape of the province. From this particular point in time, we have a plethora of military maps that cover everything from camp plans to fortification plans to the type of map that's in front of us here, which is very much a provincial military map and a regional military map. This one, of course, drawn by Bartlett, is an important map because it shows us, for example, the natural and man-made landscape that would have been important to armies at that time. And in particular, we know that the landscape of the province formed a very important part of the kind of routeways into Ulster in particular, with the gap of the north here, of course being fundamental to where English armies would have passed during the 9 Years' War. We also know, of course, that quite a number of buildings would have been included in red on this map, which then in turn became key English fortifications. And again, Bartlett even showcased this landscape even further by his production of multiple fortification plans, like this one of the Moray Pass and Castle. Again, a very fundamental part of that entryway into the province of Ulster. So that by the early 17th century, that sort of military landscape and the use of maps as part of that military landscape and the subjugation of the province was becoming more important. So of course, we all know that in 1607, the Flight of the Earls ensured that the lands of Ulster became forfeit to the Crown. And at that point in time, you now had a situation where English administrators effectively were becoming the masters of lands that they didn't necessarily know that much about. And so they began to commission surveys. The first survey was a written survey in 1608 that wasn't very successful, so that by 1609 they were engaging with map makers to begin a process of mapping the province of Ulster. And that became what we now know today as the Bodley Survey. Bodley, for example, and the team that he worked amongst were given the instruction that they were to produce maps so that readily and by the eye known bounds of every country might be discerned, to include the church land and the temporal land, and to then also show the shares for the undertakers being laid out. So with the shares to the undertakers being laid out, maps effectively at this point in time become part of the apparatus that carved up the province of Ulster into the plantation estates, and became a visual record of what the plans for plantation actually were. For example, we now have 28 of these maps surviving. There are a number of tracings of maps also surviving for County Donegal in the library in Trinity College in Dublin, but these ones are in the National Archives in London. They produced these maps, 28 of these maps, on a barony basis, which of course became effectively the precinct for the plantation. And then in turn, the Irish townlands became the proportions. The interesting thing about these maps is that, of course, they fundamentally show the viability of landscape. And so you can see, for example, the inclusion of everything from rivers to mountains to bogs and to forestry, all of which, of course, would have been important for settlers coming to Ulster to understand where their lands were and what they could potentially use. They also included key settlements. So on the barony of Armagh, for example, you can see where I have it surrounded there, where you have the town of Armagh, and also the likes of Charlemont Fort, which of course was very much part of that existing English landscape in the province. Again, this particular set of maps was then sent back to the English government. We have the correspondence in 1610, and those maps, as they say, besides the county of Derry, were newly bound up into 6 books for His Majesty's view. Interestingly, they're accompanied by this map, which is an overview map, which is now in Hatfield House, which, although it's quite faded here, actually shows the outline of every barony in the province of Ulster. So it's almost like the master plan for smaller maps, which were then produced on the small scale. By 1610, things were moving apace, and maps then became very much part and parcel of the understanding of how that landscape was changing, particularly with the production of maps like these, which showed the sheeted counties of the province of Ulster. This particular map by Jordan Norden, now in the British Library, for example, shows each and every individual proportion, and it actually includes the name of the undertaker or the servitor or the deserving native who achieved that land, the size of their estate, and then in turn the lands that they were receiving as part of that estate. So very much giving a visual representation to where people were going to be located in plantation. As time progresses, of course, maps begin to record other types of plantation, like the Londonderry plantation. And a second key element focused, for example, from this period on the estates of the London companies in the former County Coleraine. The engagement, of course, with the London companies gave rise to very much the formal breakup of that area into 12 proportions, representing the holdings of the 12 great livery companies of the city. And during their formative years, many individual livery companies began to request surveys of their lands. This particular set of maps, which is at Draper's Hall, seems to have been a survey commissioned by Sir Thomas Phillip. And Sir Thomas Phillip had estates in the county of Coleraine prior to the London companies achieving their lands, and was somewhat disgruntled by the fact that he was forced into what he considered to be the lesser lands around Limavady. But what came from that commission was a beautiful set of maps during the period of time in which he was appointed as a commissioner in 1622. The survey contains the master map, which I showed a few seconds ago, but then in turn also a map of each individual company's lands, along with a map of each individual company's buildings on their estate. So it gives a very visual representation of how the London companies were actually beginning to build towns within the plantation, or villages within the plantation. And you can see here, for example, in the ironmonger's proportion, that Sir George Canning's house is very much dominant in the map, surrounded by what could be considered that very traditional English exoskeleton wood structure housing, but then in turn cabins, which were possibly still those being used by Scottish or Irish settlers. So these maps are very much part of that visual apparatus of understanding what building and architecture began to look like within the plantation as well. Again, part of that kind of phase of plantation planning was also the development of towns and urban areas. And amongst the kind of cities and towns that were very much focused upon were the likes of Londonderry or Derry and Coleraine. And we know that under the plans for plantation, 25 new corporate towns were actually planned. So as early as 1611, for example, Thomas Raven, who becomes a central and key mapmaker in the Londonderry plantation, was producing a plan of what would be the new city at Derry. And this particular plan, you can see, doesn't look necessarily like the walled city we know today, because it is actually only enclosed on 3 sides rather than on the 4 sides. But you can see the positioning of the city is very much that which is in evidence there today. And you can see how, for example, the walls were being developed and how that kind of gridiron street pattern was fundamentally imprinted on the landscape. By 1619, in Pinner's survey, again, you get a much more detailed representation of the emerging city. And you can see, for example, in this particular plan that it is now actually enclosed on 4 sides. You can see how the quays are beginning to be operational, bringing commercial activity to the region, and how, for example, the beginnings of the requirements for housing in the city were beginning to be developed along the roads and the routeways through to what today would be the Diamond. By 1622, Thomas Raven's maps for the Phillips survey again was giving an even more detailed view. You can see that by then more housing had been built, the beginning of the churches that were in place, some garrison buildings were in place, and you can even see the likes of lime kilns at the top of the map there, showing how industrial function was beginning to emerge. Similarly, estate development begins to emerge at the end phase of plantation, when many of the central and large landowners began to commission their own sets of maps. So, for example, this particular set of maps belongs to the Clandeboy estates and was produced in 1625 and 1626, again by Thomas Raven. It's an interesting period on the estate because it's a period when a dispute was ongoing between Lord Montgomery and Clandeboy about the boundary of their estate. So as a result, this focus of the survey is very much on the boundaries within the estate and the land grants on each of the lands. The particular survey contains 75 maps, so a very, very detailed survey, and again includes even more detailed descriptions of some of the landscape, the small rural villages that were beginning to emerge, like Killaleigh. The house of Killaleigh, for example, is included there, and even the likes of parkland on the estate. There's no real physical commentary on this map, other than a description merely of the landscape. So, as you can see, across the lifetime of the mapping of the Ulster Plantation, we can really adjudge that the Ulster Plantation was the most extensively surveyed of all of the plantations in Ireland. As English officials became more involved with the province, mapping underwent significant change, reflecting the changing needs and roles of the government in the province right across the spectrum of plantation years. And as the government's relationship with Ulster continued to change, it moved through all of those phases from reconnaissance right through to preparing for plantation, and then of course to the landowners themselves producing their own estate maps of plantation. So in a modern appraisal, when you look across the catalogue of maps, which I had the good fortune to do, we can really divide them up into those types of categories. Of course, people at the time wouldn't have seen the entire corpus of what was there, but they really do reflect an attempt to record changing landscape throughout the decades of plantation, very much as the landscape of the province moved from that kind of native Gaelic footprint right through to the ideal of the English ordered and planned estates. So in many instances, maps themselves became very much the agents of control that Willie Smith talks about, creating that blueprint for the future development of the province along English lines. And in that regard, the maps effectively offer us a window onto the settlement of Ulster, recording key features of the plantation, including everything from architecture to land boundary changes to urban and estate development, and even right down to the people, the settlers on the estate. Thank you very much.
So if I can introduce to you our second speaker in the panel, Andrew Kane. Andrew works as a research consultant with the Ulster Historical Foundation, and his voice is well known in his home town of Coleraine and along the north coast, where he's been actively involved for many years in family history research. Just in 2024, he published with the foundation the Townland Atlas of Ulster, by which all over 16,000 townlands in the province were included. Today he will talk to us about mapping the Ulster Plantation Estates. Andrew.
Okay, well thank you very much, Paddy, and good afternoon everyone. Today I'm just going to talk a little bit about my experience of creating the Townland Atlas of Ulster in relation to the really try to recreate the plantation estates and work forward from there. So I'm going to deal with how the estates were described before the plantation, what mapping was available at its outset, very much along the same lines as Annaleigh has already covered, the maps created during the plantation and in its immediate aftermath, noting the dramatic improvement in surveying techniques as the 17th century progressed, and then finally how gaps in the surviving mapping can be reconstructed. Okay, so prior to the plantation, surveying was done by inquisition, where local jurors confirmed the boundaries of a property, including the names of the smaller denominations making up the estates, and these are what we would call townlands. Here we have an extract from the County Antrim Inquisition of 1605, and up here we can see that it describes the Killeela estate of Níl O'Neil. So it describes the boundaries, and then it goes on to list 12 of the 20 townlands that fall within that area, followed by the remark, with others whose names, on account of the long devastation of the country, the jurors cannot learn. So this shows both the strength and weakness of the Inquisition method used alone, in that you know exactly what they're talking about because of the boundaries, but what's inside is very much up to people's knowledge, and they don't really seem to have gone into too much bother to find out. So, and the scant mapping done at the time is insufficient to identify the precise boundaries on the ground. So in 1548, Walter Cowley was appointed the first Surveyor General of Ireland. And although this was a very progressive sounding appointment, it did not result in a great flurry of official or accurate map making. His role consisted mainly of determining the financial value of estates, and he was specifically excluded from a role in surveying forfeited land which remained under the direct control of the Lord Deputy. This map you've seen already this afternoon. It's the Francis Jobson map of around 1590, showing what really prevailed before the plantation. Large estates are marked and there's boundaries shown and names and so on, but scale and detail are markedly absent. Jobson, in his correspondence, refers to various estates outside Ulster which he provided maps for, but none, to my knowledge, none of these survive. But the game was changed totally with the flight of the Earls and the subsequent forfeiture of 6 whole counties in Western Ulster, making a huge area available for redistribution by the Crown. The Surveyor General at this time was William Parsons, who held the post from 1602 right up to 1641, so the whole plantation period up to the 1641 rebellion. His reputation, unfortunately, with professional map makers was very poor indeed. Thomas Raven was scathing of him. And it was left to the military men like Sir Josiah Bodley and Nicholas Pinner to perform the role of surveyor as we would understand it in the distribution of estates under the plantation. Royal Commissioners visited Ulster from Dublin in 1609, and their instructions were to make an accurate survey or measurement of the arable lands in each county, that the names and situations of each Ballyboe, Tate, Quarter and Pole should be preserved and expressed on carefully prepared maps, as well as the name of every lake, river, brook, wood, fort, bog and any other landmark throughout the said 6 counties. The Commissioners were also required to identify separate church lands and designate the precincts, baronies in each county to the several intended occupants, and marking off the arable land in proportions to suit planters. These proportions of 1, 1.5 or 2,000 acres are the plantation estates which survived in one form or another right up to the Land Purchase Acts of the 20th century. Now this mammoth task was commenced by the Commissioners at Armagh Assizes on the 8th of August 1609, and they finished their work at Cavan Assizes on the 30th of September the same year. Less than 2 months to measure, survey and combine into equally valuable estates the entirety of 6 complete counties. Clearly a lot of preparatory work was done before they arrived, and you've already heard about the maps of Josiah Bodley in that regard. But a large part of the work was simply appropriating the status quo. The unit, now known as a townland and described in the instructions, Bodley's instructions there as the Ballyboe, Tate, Quarter or Pole, were already integral to Irish landholding. As such, units were ubiquitous. They were assumed to be roughly equal, approximately equivalent to half an English ploughland, and estimated to include 60 acres of arable land. This gross assumption on the basis of acreage is the basis of acreage as given in the plantation grants and even 40 years later in the civil survey. So you can see here how the adoptions of the Gaelic system did not end with taking the townland features. The lands of Gaelic lords are the estates that we see mapped on the Elizabethan era maps, like the Jobson map. But these were then distributed among his chief followers as Ballybeatas, a unit of more or less 16 townlands. So on the basis of an estimated 60 acres per townland, the Ballybeata therefore consisted of 960 or approximately 1,000 arable acres. As the small proportion granted under the plantation was to be 1,000 acres, civil servants drawing up these estates had basically a ready-made template for their work, and the extent to which the new proportions matched the existing Ballybeatas, whose names they often adopted, is a fascinating subject for further research. This is the Bodley map for Lochensholen barony, which I have, in my course of my work for producing my atlas, I then had this as a Queen's copy, and I had put in the modern spelling of each townland name. So you can see that we've already heard how many maps survived. Armagh, Tyrone, Donegal and Fermanagh. Armagh, Tyrone, Fermanagh and Cavan have all their maps, barony maps survive. For Donegal, there are no maps other than sketches, and for Londonderry, we simply have Lochansholen, this barony, as it was originally part of County Tyrone. The fieldwork was recorded in books without measurement, and the maps completed elsewhere. So the basic assumption that each ballyboe or townland was equal size is demonstrably wrong, but is a useful rule of thumb for a royal commission in a hurry. Some of the Bodley maps are great. This one is very good. You can see how it lines up with the modern townlands practically one-to-one. Very occasionally there are further combinations or splits, but practically one-to-one there. This map is practically useless for linking grants to modern place names. But as the unit used is much larger, it's often described in papers as a quarter, but it seems to be much larger than a quarter would be in any of the other counties, and is no longer in use. We do see some correlation to this for in the books of survey and distribution, which we'll discuss later, where specific townlands are allocated to each quarter, but only for the barony of Macrostepina, and not, unfortunately, for Knocknany or the other counties. Armagh, which Annaleigh also showed you, is an absolute classic. It did my head in because it's upside down and back to front. You can see when I started to write in the names of the townlands, I go, how can that be to the side of this one below? It just doesn't make any sense. Well seen, it's done out in an office from somebody who couldn't understand somebody else's handwriting. These maps, though, are essential in understanding the plantation grants, because it's the names on these maps that are used in the grants, which are happily collected together and preserved in George Hill's plantation in Ulster. As you can see here, this is one of the County Tyrone grants to Edward Kingswell, and it lists all the ballyboes, and then it gives a total of 1,000 acres, and it refers to these ballyboes containing 60 acres each, and so on and so forth. In his magisterial work, Plantation Acres, Professor Andrews refers to the poor quality of the Bodley maps, noting in particular that the barony maps don't even fit together. And this is highlighted in the case of Ballycolway. It's a Ballybeta, or quarter in Knocknany barony, which we saw earlier, on its boundary with Tullyhaw barony in County Cavan. It's not included in the maps of either barony, and so was not included in the plantation grants. So, and subsequently Lady Maguire was able to successfully petition the Crown for the rents of this land on the basis of a pre-Flight of the Earls grant, which is really amazing whenever we think about how we view the plantation. But they just said, oh, it hasn't been granted to anybody else, it must still belong to the Maguires. So, and indeed the work done by the commissioners at Coleraine Assizes, which took over a week or 10 days at the end of August, was totally wasted, as that county was not even included in the conventional plantation scheme, and instead was divided into the 12 estates that Annaleigh has already talked about. Now, this was done in 1610. It was the City of London signed an agreement with the Privy Council to take on the Londonderry plantation. But although it was not until 1613 that a royal charter incorporated the Irish Society which administered that particular plantation and created the new county of Londonderry from the old county Coleraine and neighbouring chunks of Antrim, Tyrone and Donegal. The new county consisted of much larger estates than the other planted areas, and a detailed valuation of each townland was undertaken to ensure that each estate was of exactly equal value. And you can see here that the surveyors for the London companies have actually gone out at each townland and they have given a valuation. Now the valuation is at 4 pence in the pound and so on, giving every estate a nominal annual value of £138.15, although the number of townlands varies from 27 on the Clothworkers estate and the plains outside Coleraine to 65 townlands in the Skinners estate in the uplands of the Sperrins. So if that had been under the ordinary scheme, those would have just been considered equivalent townlands. The individual companies, guilds, then produced maps of their own estates, and several of them show the Ballybeatas as well as the townlands, such as this one of the Ironmonger's estate of Manor of Lizard. The Londoners had engaged Thomas Raven to survey their lands, but when Thomas Phillips came in dispute with the London companies, he engaged Richard Hadser to produce alternative maps of each state in the 1620s as part of that dispute, and these are preserved in the volume Londonderry and the London Companies, 1609 to 1629, which was published by PRONI back in 1928. I can just, although these maps do not really show very clearly the outlines, you couldn't walk the boundaries of each of those townlands based on that map. Again, you can see there's one name, modern and old, they're easily identifiable, but the large green type are the Ballybeatas. You can see how they are not even all in one homogeneous group, but they can have wee outliers as well. Okay, other estate owners also mapped their estates. This is the Hadser map, again showing names but no boundaries or whatever. That is the grocer's company outside Derry City. Okay. Other estate owners have mapped their estates with varying degrees of accuracy, and these remain an important source of detail for an admittedly small proportion of estates. The major upheavals of 1641 and the subsequent Cromwellian Wars led to a further flurry of official surveying. This is the civil survey conducted by commissioners appointed in each county to determine and record the possessions of the proprietors of land as of the 23rd of October 1641. So again, you can see here how they have assumed the 60 acres per townland, but they've got all the names and they've done some sort of apportionment between arable and pasture and so on. But it's hardly what you would call an accurate survey. The commissioners were to be revenue officials and or other able and knowing men of the country, and distinct local juries were impanelled in each barony to assist the commissioners in the way the inquisitions were done. They were to find out and inquire into every particular, but only where necessary to view and tread the metes and bounds of the premises. You say, I can't imagine they did very much. So, while the survey has acreages and values, these are no more than estimates or the current rental, and no maps were produced with this survey. But it is important. It only survives for the counties of Tyrone, Donegal and Londonderry, but where it does survive, at least it gives us a full list. You can say, here are all the townlands that were identified in that county. So if we don't know who owned one from other sources, that's a gap we have to fill. And unfortunately, it's only for 3 of the 6 planted counties. The quantity of surveying takes a massive leap forward here with the appointment of Sir William Petty to complete the Down survey. Petty had come to Ireland as a physician, but he soon came into dispute with the Surveyor General Benjamin Worsley over the conduct of the detailed survey of forfeited and church lands identified in the civil survey reports. Petty took over this work himself and produced maps and acreages that I think are remarkable in their quality and relative accuracy, not only for their own time, but comparable to anything before the establishment of the Ordnance Survey in the 1820s. Now, although not within the official plantation, the estates of the Earl of Antrim, which covered 6 whole baronies of northern County Antrim, clearly demonstrate the problem that denominations recorded in the Down Survey, and indeed all of the 17th century sources, are not always precisely aligned with the townlands recognised by the Ordnance Survey. And you can see here I have the green lines represent the boundaries in the Down Survey map, and the black lines is where they are the ones we know today. Basically, a lot of these, particularly upland areas, are shown by quarter, maybe 3 townlands, or even some of them are just, we can see townlands that have been clearly divided into upper and lower subsequently. But generally speaking, it gives us an idea of what's covered in the documents. So if you're looking for what happened in take a townland there, Turnavennog in Lochgiel, you know that it's part of Ballynock quarter, simply from this map, and you can look up Ballynock as your reference for that townland. Okay, the range of descriptive words for places now identified as townlands, that's not particularly clear on that, shows just that these sub-denominations existed at the time, but were simply not recorded unless they were required. So we can't assume that just because a place is not named on these maps, that it wasn't called by that name at that time, and you can often find reference to it in leases and rentals and so on. And although the surveyors only map the potentially forfeit and church lands, they are accurate enough to allow us to determine the limits of estates not subject to the Cromwellian depredations, and can determine which subsequent subdivisions fall within certain estates and which do not. And the description of the boundaries also pinpoint the extent of individual land holdings. These, the Down survey maps are available in PRONI under D of 597. So the final piece of the jigsaw is provided by the books. This is about the different names. You can see here that quarter, 20 acres, half town, so on, townland and town and lands are all used for things that we would identify as one townland today, and they vary enormously in size from those mid-century sources. So hopefully you've been upstairs and were able to see a copy of the books of survey and distribution upstairs. There's a County Down volume open, and they really are brilliant. They were compiled after the restoration of Charles II in 1660. And an Annaleigh copy of this criminally underused source is held in PRONI, and you can see one of the volumes. They are also can be consulted readily under microfilm MIC 532. But it draws together the ownership information from the civil survey, the map references and accurate acreages from the Down survey, and best of all, it actually covers 8.5 of the 9 counties of Ulster. Apologies to anyone from Fermanagh, because you're the half. You contain the half county that is missing. So, but it also states who own each land unit before, not under the short-term Cromwellian allocation to soldiers and adventurers, but rather the restoration settlement following the deliberations of the Court of Claims. So, quickly finish off here. No one document can give us all the information we need to map the plantation estates. But the sheer variety of 17th century sources, and I use all of these sources to help map my estates in my atlas. The sheer variety allows us to complete the picture by the interplay between them. This is the finished product. This is part of the plantation estates map for the barony of Coleraine, and it shows the complex network of how estates are not all necessarily in one place. They're interspersed with other estates and native lands and church lands and so on. And whenever you take into account the freeholds within each London manor, the situation becomes even more interesting and much, much more complicated than you would assume. Again, in my atlas, I have sought to, for each of 400 estates across Ulster, I have referenced them to all those sources, so you can look up directly which folio or page or whatever of what the name is, because sometimes it's very difficult to use sources like the muster rolls because you don't know what it's called, that estate's called in the muster roll thing. So I think that's me. I'm sorry I had to sort of look through this very quickly because Annaleigh kept talking about all the things I was going to talk about. I should have gone first.
Thank you so much, Andrew. Our next speaker, thank you very much, Andrew. Our next speaker, Dr Dave Heffernan, is an historian of Tudor and Early Stuart Ireland. He's published numerous books, including a recent edition with the Irish Manuscripts Commission on the court minutes of the Cloth Workers' Company of London relating to their estate in Londonderry. Between 2016 and 18, he held an R.J. Hunter postdoctoral research fellowship from the Royal Irish Academy at Queen's, focused on the Ulster Plantation. He has published research pursuant from this postdoc in Annaleigh Hibernica, Irish Historical Studies, and edited collections with both Manchester University Press and Routledge. Today he will talk to us about estate records for the Ulster Plantation 1609 to 1641.
Hi. Thanks everyone. Thanks to Mary and Tom and the rest of the team just for the invite to speak today. So basically I'm going to look not at maps, because obviously they've been looked at already. So on the basically estate records going beyond the Crown surveys. So the Crown surveys, so just to give a brief overview, are basically the ones that were commissioned specifically by the Crown, almost entirely within the reign of James I, because James I was interested in the Great British project that was the Ulster Plantation, whereas his son decided he was not. So the Crown surveys, basically, they date from between 1611 up to 1622. So the first of them was undertaken by this chap, Sir George Carew, in 1611, and then they were taken very regularly over the next 11 years, so by Josias Bodley, who did the maps as well prior to the plantation, so he did a Crown survey in 1613, another in 1614, and another in 1616. The 1614 and the 1616 ones are virtually lost, apart from a small excerpt on Londonderry from the 1614 one, but the 1613 is extremely detailed. So then we have George Allen's muster of the province in 1618, Nicholas Pinnar in the winter of 1619, and then the biggest one of the lot is the Crown survey of 1622 as part of the Commission for Irish Affairs. So these are kind of, I suppose, sort of a lot of the standard surveys for how you would actually go about looking at all of the 180 odd estates across the 6 counties. But what I want to look at today is going beyond these Crown surveys to some of the often less examined estate material that exists in various archives and that are on individual estates or on individual regions. So again, as I say, some of these fill in the gap for the reign of Charles I in particular, but they also provide greater colour on some of the estates where the Crown surveys were overly specific. So the Crown surveys wanted to look at things like basically whether or not the individuals who had been granted estates were actually fulfilling the articles of plantation. So were they bringing in British tenants? Were they building, a manor house in Bawn? But they didn't. That meant that they weren't very imaginative in terms of how they looked at various other things. And the Irish are broadly absent from an awful lot of these surveys. It's as though they don't even exist on some of these estates, even though they were still the predominant population across the vast majority of West Ulster. So, what are some of these non-Crown survey estate records? Unfortunately, there is a geographical disparity in terms of how these records have actually survived. They're not even for the 6 counties. If you want to study Londonderry, basically you were in luck. The London livery companies were, as we've already kind of seen in terms of a number of papers to do with various maps kept on them and various other records, the London livery companies were some of the great record keepers of early modern England and Ireland. So they kept voluminous kind of court minutes of which details their business meetings at their meetings about twice a week in their livery halls in London. Now, obviously the vast majority of their business was to do with things like trade or their properties in London, but if you go through these volumes of court minutes, you will find every couple of pages an entry to their Irish estate and how it was being managed. And the vast majority of these court minutes survive either in the Guildhall Library in London or else in the individual livery companies' archives, it varies from company to company. They all have their own idiosyncratic way of doing it, because some of them, they moved over and back. Some of it was to do with the Blitz during the Second World War. So, there's also some disparity within these minutes from the point of view that sometimes it depended on the individual clerk. Some of them kept much more detailed records than others did. Some of them kept a kind of a synopsis of what the meeting was. Some of them copied out entire letters, so that if there was a letter being sent to, say, their tenants in Ireland, or maybe they had representatives as well in Dublin who kind of handled money for them going over to Ireland, sometimes the clerk would literally copy out the entire letter. So, as I say, it varies from company to company. So this is just a typical extract from the court minutes of the Vintners Company. So this is from October 1616, and it is to do with Baptist Jones, who was in charge of kind of managing the estate at this point. I don't call them the farmers of the estates. I think they were still more like chief tenants, because the livery companies were still managing affairs in London. They didn't just farm out the estate and then just divest themselves of any interest. They still managed it from London. So I think some of the depiction of them as farmers that was established by Moody was maybe a little bit overly excessive. Now, when it came to these minutes, as I say, they varied considerably. One of the things that meant that there would be an awful lot of records if the tenant was a particularly atrocious tenant, because then they had to constantly debate about what they were going to do about this individual. Sometimes they had to bring them over to London and go, well, look, you're 4.5 years behind on any rent, so we would like the money at some point. Other things that came up were, sometimes often quite trivial things in terms of trying to organise supplies of nails, of glass panes, of doors and locks, stuff that you had to send over in order to actually build 8 or 9 houses, or to build a kind of a manor house on your plantation village. So, it might seem like mundane records, but at the same time, if you use them imaginatively, these are very useful for recreating how an actual plantation was built. Again, as I say, it does vary from company to company. So, for most of them, it's the court minutes that you would look at. But for a number of the companies, there were clerks who decided to put together volumes which specifically dealt with the Irish estate. So, specifically for the goldsmiths, the ironmongers, and the cloth workers. So this image comes from a volume that was put together by Henry Carter, who was the clerk of the Goldsmiths Company in the 1610s. This is a very, very large volume. It's like 750 pages of records. It recreates letters, and it also has things like this. So this is a survey that was undertaken in 1614 by Andrew Bowdler and Robert Glenn, who were 2 surveyors that were appointed by the company after they had received their lands in December 1613. The plantation had been established for 3.5 years at that point, but the distribution of the 12 estates to the livery companies was done by lottery in London in December 1613. So there's this flurry of activity into 1614 as they all tried to figure out, well, what is it that we actually now own? And this was kind of a product of how they figured that out. Now, I suppose one of the benefits of this particular example is that it proves the fact that this is a lengthy survey. It goes on for, I think it's about 8 or 9 pages overall. And one of the things it reveals is that there were already British tenants on this particular estate. So it wasn't as though they were coming into their estates in Londonderry and having to plant them fresh from the beginning. Basically, the natural order of there being good land on the Goldsmiths estate meant that there was British settlers already after drifting here by the end of 1613 into 1614. That's to a certain extent because the Goldsmiths estate was right next to the town of Derry, so people wanted to live there. It would have been very different if you'd have gone down into the Drapers and the Skinners' lands down in Loching Sholan, where mountainous territory that was very heavily forested. So that is one of the examples of these 3 volumes. The other one that I'll look at here very briefly is the Ironmonger's Book of Estate Records. Ironically enough, put together by a chap called R. Hunter, which is actually led once or twice when I've submitted something to somebody, to an editor coming back and going, oh, you need to reference it as R.J. Hunter. And this is like, no, it's not. So R. Hunter put this together, and it's about 200 folios, a mix of documents. Some of it actually has, I think there's 2 maps in there. And again, it just covers letters, various estate records, but all to do with Ireland, not just extracts from court minutes. An actual clerk in London saying that it was important to put together a full volume of Irish records. So one of the things, this sheds an awful lot of light in terms of, again, the things that are missed in the Crown surveys, that actually give some colour to things. So, for instance, it was on the Ironmonger's estate that an awful lot from this volume that a lot of the records about the conspiracy against the plantation in 1615, that a lot of those records actually come from. So, this threat that various members of the local Irish families were going to try and attack the plantation in 1615, which was detailed extensively in the late Ray Gillespie's book, Conspiracy, Ulster Plots and Plotters. So that's the Ironmonger's volume. Then there are other ones that are very much random sort of survivals. So this is a page from a rental in the Guildhall Library. So it relates to the Mercer's estate between 1628 and 1631. Now why this is particularly valuable is just the late date of it. Most of the livery company records, they're very extensive for the 1610s and for much of the 1620s. But then they just kind of drop off of a cliff after around 1625, 1626. Because of course Charles I was starting to look into taking over their lands from them, and they became disinterested really in trying to develop them, because why would you invest time and energy into developing estates that were going to be confiscated by the Crown? So this one is kind of late for 1628 and 1631. And what's also interesting about it is that it involves a specific breakdown in terms of the distribution of money to the cooks, the masons, and the broderers. So one of the things that kind of gets overlooked a lot within the studies of the London Dairy Plantation is that there were dozens of companies involved. So when we talk about the kind of the 12 estates, these were the 12 great livery companies at the time, but there were 55 companies originally. Not all of them got involved, but nearly all of the companies had a number of sub-companies that were involved with them in their particular plantation, and depending on how much money they had contributed, they did have a little bit of a say in terms of what happened. Some of them sold out to the main livery company over time, but as this one indicates, the cooks and the masons and the broderers still had a say in what was happening on the Mercer's lands as late as 1628. Okay, so that's broadly some of the material on Londonderry. I could go on about that because there is just so much material that just hasn't been properly looked at in the livery company records, and some of it is it's just there's an awful lot more material to be more research to be done on that. And some of it is upstairs. In fact, upstairs has a number of documents that are actually no longer in London because they were copied out in the 1920s, and the originals were destroyed during the Blitz. So upstairs actually has the surviving copies. So in terms of the other 5 counties, as I say, it is much more hit and miss in terms of what's actually available and what isn't. Quite simply, for some proportions across Armagh, Cavan, Fermanagh, Donegal, Tyrone, there is hardly any material other than the Crown surveys. But there are either individual proportions or individual precincts that there is a much greater amount of material, and really interesting material. So this particular image, which obviously doesn't come across great there on the thing that I took that on a very poor camera about 10 years ago. But this is from the Lane manuscripts in Edinburgh University Library. And there's a photostat copy of these upstairs. It's T544, which this is taken from. But these records relate to the proportions of Killeen and Eden in the barony of Strabane between 1613 and 1618. Now what's really useful about these is that they're a mix of kind of rentals and also just incidental disbursements, various administrative records. You could call them kind of a miscellany of administrative records relating to these 2 proportions over this 5-6 year period. And what they reveal is that, you know, if you were to look at Bodley or Nicholas Pinnar at the beginning and end of that period, you'd see very little development on these 2 proportions. You know, you'd have a little bit of a record of the building work that had been done, and there was a couple of British tenants. But you don't see much beyond that. But when you look at the Hamilton records, what you see is that the Irish are still basically in charge of the plantation. They're doing everything. They're building the houses. They're administering the estate pretty much. So Patrick Groom O'Devon is basically the middleman who's running everything there. And on top of that, you know, you even have things like somebody being paid to take a letter to Dublin on behalf of the Hamiltons and then returning with a horse that one of the Hamiltons had asked him to buy. So you get an awful lot more kind of colour of what's actually going on beyond what's in the Crown surveys. So if we had more records like this for a lot of the other estates in the other 5 counties, I suspect we would have an awful lot more colour about what's going on there too. But unfortunately, it is very hit or miss. There are others. I'm not going to dwell on it because it was basically these records were covered in such detail by Hunter in his dissertation and in his articles. So if you take Armagh and Cavan, you have stuff in the National Library like the Farnham papers, the Fingal papers and the Rolleston papers, which again provide quite a bit of information on the estates there. I'm sure one that many of you will be familiar with are the Balfour rentals for Fermanagh in 1632, 1636, one of which is actually on display upstairs today. And then there are the Hastings manuscripts in the Huntington Library, which deal with the lands that were originally granted to the Irish Attorney General, John Davies, who had an outsized role in actually planning the plantation. And again, they come from a later date. So a lot of those are from kind of the late 1620s and in particular the 1630s. So again, they are particularly useful for filling that gap where there just aren't any Crown surveys in the 1630s. Then there are kind of the records that are smaller in size, but maybe a little bit more obscure and less known about, but that they also have a particular value. So this particular document, sorry, that's the Balfour. This document comes from Buckinghamshire Records Office. So it is to do with the sale of the Tonaforus and Dromore and Lorga proportions in the precinct of Lifford in Donegal in 1637. Now, there are articles of agreement around selling this particular estate, which normally in articles of agreement would just be a legal document. It might have the value of the sale and the lands involved, but it wouldn't have a huge amount of information. What was particularly useful in this particular instance is that they appended a full list of the tenants, so dozens of individuals that were still living on this proportion in 1637, and as you will not be surprised to hear, there was still predominantly Irish tenants, so it was becoming more of a kind of a mix. That's a pretty obscure record from a local record office in England. I suspect that there are more that we don't know about. A lot of them are referenced in David Edwards and Brian Donovan's British Sources for Irish History, but inevitably Dave and Brian were compiling their catalogue, what would it be, 35 years ago. So there could be other records that have since been catalogued properly and that are now, that it's apparent that they are in those archives. So, that is in terms of these kind of smaller records. I was going to say something about the Inquisitions of Ulster. I'll skip through it pretty quickly because I'm conscious of time. These were compiled in the 19th century. They are used extensively in the historiography, but I think that they're still underutilised for the very simple reason that they combine so much Latin and English at the same time that I think that there's a modern kind of a reluctance to use some of them. And embedded an awful lot of the time in these inquisitions are actually the names of tenants and of lands and of various little bits of disputes that were occurring on particular estates. Looking beyond West Ulster, and these are kind of incidental things. I don't want to deal too much on East Ulster because I'm kind of sticking to the six officially counted counties. But in terms of how we kind of tend to look at it in terms of the official plantation in the west, and then there's the unofficial plantation in the east, and that there's kind of almost as though they obey county boundaries that are there today. But the records often they go over and back between each other. So an awful lot of the London Livery records, for instance, do actually contain material that is relevant to Antrim. So you'll get references to the Earl of Antrim, who was providing credit an awful lot of time to the livery companies because it was easier to have MacDonald provide money or resources, and then the companies could repay him later on, rather than them trying to send over money and resources. Then there are other records in terms of Charles Monk's survey of the ports of Ulster taken in 1637. A very detailed record in terms of the kind of administration of the ports and the kind of things that were coming in. So it kind of, I suppose, supplements the port books from 1612 to 1615, but in terms of what was happening a quarter of a century later. So it deals with things to do with smuggling, what the interconnections were between these officials, what they were being paid. And again, if you use these, they might seem like kind of drab or sources to a certain extent, but when you actually dig down into them, if they're used imaginatively, they can reveal quite an awful lot about what is going on in Ulster at that time. So sometimes there are the kind of accidental discoveries. So Richard Boyle tried to basically buy the entire precinct of Boyle and Banna in 1630, 1631. Now, most people wouldn't think to look at the estate records of the first Earl of Cork when they're going studying the Ulster Plantation. But in one of these letter books that is in Chatsworth House, you do find the fact that he tried to purchase an enormous chunk of Donegal at this time from John Murray, the Earl of Annandale. So again, this kind of points towards the very fact that there can be an awful lot of records that are not found in immediately obvious places in order to study the plantation. I'll leave it there.
Okay, could I invite the other two speakers just to join us up at the front? We don't have the dreamt of 15 minutes, but we've a few minutes in case there are any burning questions out there. Thank the three speakers for the fine detail, the fine-grained detail, both in terms of representations in maps and detailed sources like court records, and thinking imaginatively about crossing boundaries to source some of the sources. Anyone have a question? Yeah, Brendan?
They were great papers, very, very enjoyable. I was just wondering, Dave, the London Company's records, you're saying there was one that's 700 odd pages or something. They're not in print, they're all manuscript, they haven't been published anywhere.
Yeah, so the 700 one is the volume that Henry Carter put together for the goldsmiths. So some of it in the first 200 pages is actually copies of documents, so the motives and whatever that Phillips drew up and stuff like that. But it's a huge amount of letters, and then some of it is interspersed with court minutes. 750 pages. It's enormous.
Yeah.
Can I ask where it's kept? Where you got
the archives at Goldsmiths Hall.
Having had Annaleigh on that ice for so long to maybe tempt her back through the window. One of the interesting things I think over the last 10 years, or maybe even just in the last 5 years, there's been a flush of new publication about James I, James VI as monarch. And one of the things that's come through that Andrew obliquely referred to, which is the idea that this was a project, the Ulster Plantation, to draw together English and Scottish into a British entity. Do you see anybody, from that fine detail of court records to the maps or other representations that kind of hints at that process, that view?
I suppose in a way you do, in that the maps in themselves capture the information really around all settlers. So that you see kind of with the maps, the kind of names of the planters being introduced that are both Scottish and English, kind of geographically locating them in that landscape. You don't necessarily see anything that appears as part of a very definitive project like that, but I suppose you could infer that obviously the interest is there in understanding where the two groupings end up in the Ulster Plantation. If that makes sense.
Thank you. No, thank you, Annaleigh. Yeah?
Are there estate records in the borders of Scotland and England that give reference to their landowner going to Ulster and taking actual tenants with them?
I haven't come across them. It's a good question, but I haven't. I've been through basically, in terms of local English records and records office and Scotland, I've been through Edwards and Donovan pretty systematically and tried to locate anything that I thought would be in a local record office, and I didn't come across anything like that. Again, there's been it's 35 years, there could be stuff that's been catalogued since, and I suspect Scotland would be the place to look more so than England. But no, I haven't come across anything.
Because there's such an interest in reivers and so on, recent climate, and yet it's frustrating that
there are documents on the movement of some of the border reivers just within the state papers, but not as state records.
The fact that so many of the Scots came later, also, it's very difficult to say because it's such a short distance. You just don't know when they came.
Question at the back left there.
Yeah, it's just a comment really in terms of the question from was asked there, certainly part of the Scottish Privy Council records, which are published in the 1620s and the 1630s, there are kind of orders being issued from Edinburgh to stop the movement of kind of skilled agricultural labour and tenants moving over
Thank you.
to Ulster. And I think if you're going to pre-plantation, obviously there was 1606 Hamilton Montgomery settlement, which is a kin-based community Ayrshire migration of social diverse.
Thanks, John. Question here?
Was there a geographical split between the English and Scottish settlers? For example, did the Scottish settlers favour remaining in the eastern part of those 6 counties and the English more to the west?
There's definitely, because the each barony was allocated to either English, Irish, Scottish and government employees, servitors, there's very much a focus on certainly at the landlord level, of concentration of Scots in particular baronies, particularly Strabane, for example. But you find that the tenants below that are such a mishmash. Really, there's no rhyme or reason. I think the reason there's a predomination of Scots in the east is Scotland's only 12 to 20 miles away.
Yes, that's what it was.
You know.
I think just if you want a sweeping generalisation, probably it works more north-south. So crudely North Ulster, more Scottish, more Presbyterian in background, South Ulster, more English.
Yeah, if it's in Armagh in particular,
exactly.
has a higher percentage of English than Scots.
But you also have Scots in the barony of Knockninny that you referenced earlier, and also Macroboy.
Yeah, well, I mean, as I say, there are sort of 35 baronies, and Scots got a third of them, so there's going to be Scots everywhere.
It's for that reason that I use the term broad generalisation. Don't like to use the word sweeping too often. Okay, folks, thanks very, very much for your attention. Thanks to all 3 speakers, including Annaleigh, particularly perhaps for making herself available.